Between 1943 and 1945, the Allied powers of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union attended a series of conferences aimed to decide their approach to the Second World War and what their post-war foreign policies would look like. The first of these conferences took place in Tehran in 1943, where the key figures in attendance were Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The purpose of the Tehran Conference in 1943 was for the Allied powers to discuss how to defeat the Axis powers. The USA wanted the Soviet Union's help in defeating Japan, while the Soviets wanted freedom to pursue land gains in Poland in exchange. Where there was some disagreement was around if the Allies should engage Nazi Germany from the west as well as the east. The answer was ultimately agreed to be a yes, and a double attack came via France in June 1944. All in all, Tehran was a conference with little disagreement. 1945 is mostly known for the defeat of the Axis powers and the effective end of the Second World War. However, the year contains the roots of the Cold War too, and these were first visible at the Yalta Conference. Germany had been decimated by the Second World War, and what to do about the country had to be determined by the Allied powers of Great Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. The Yalta Conference built on the agreement to divide Germany into 4 zones, with one zone controlled by each of the US, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. The German capital was agreed to be divided into 4 zones, controlled by one country each too. Where there was disagreement at Yalta was on how much the Allies would take from Germany in reparations. The solution to this would be agreed later, but at Yalta it was agreed that a commission would be set up to look into the issue, perhaps as a way of kicking the can down the road, and thus preventing open hostilities between the Allies while the war was still going on. There was additionally awareness from the democracies at Yalta, namely Britain and America, that they had fundamentally different values from the Soviets, so they offered a degree of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe on the condition that free and fair elections could take place in those countries previously controlled by the Nazis in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, one of which was Poland. The Soviets reiterated their commitment from the 1943 Tehran Conference to help the US defeat Japan, while the United Nations was established as a means of de-escalating potential conflicts in the future. A great deal changed between the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, however. The US president who was at Yalta, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had died, and it had become obvious that Stalin would not respect the democratic processes in Eastern Europe that the US wanted. The issue of Poland was particularly pressing, as in March 1945, after the Yalta Conference had taken place, Stalin had started arresting non-communist Polish politicians. A key disagreement, first at Yalta and then Potsdam, was around how much in reparations from Germany the Soviet Union would be allowed to take. It is widely agreed that the rise of the Nazis was partly due to the financial struggles of Germany following the huge reparations forced on the country after the First World War, that the Germans then had to pay back during the Great Depression, and the UK and US didn't want to risk making this error again. Stalin, meanwhile, wanted as much from Germany as possible, especially given the huge losses in soldiers his country had suffered. Ultimately, the disagreement was partially resolved on the basis that each power would be able to take reparations from the zone that they controlled. Truman, an even stronger critic than Stalin than the previous president Roosevelt had been, opposed this. Further tensions between the US and USSR came with regards to the atomic bomb. President Truman had found out that the US had a working atomic bomb during the conference, but he was elusive about this to Stalin. Stalin knew of the atomic bomb's existence thanks to his spies, but he believed that Truman's elusiveness highlighted the extent of distrust between the two countries and justified in his mind his hostility towards the United States. What we can see between the 3 conferences is the steady decline in the relationships between the Allies and the political differences which would dominate the world for the next 4 decades. At Tehran, the Allies had a focused discussion on steps to end the Second World War, but by Yalta and Potsdam in 1945, the conferences had become centered on the divisive issues of the level of punishment that would be given to Germany and the issue of democracy in Eastern Europe. Relations, particularly between the US and the USSR, would grow ever more frosty and ultimately result in the Cold War. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing. I will see you again soon.